Well, welcome everyone to the Duluth Art Institute Professional Development Series. I am coming to you live from the historic Lincoln Park building in Duluth, Minnesota. The Professional Development Series is a 6-week program where we will be covering a variety of subjects and topics. And the goal is to help you on your creative journey and help you hit some of those goals that you have in the coming year. So this program is also made possible by a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board. And our first guest in the series today is Moira Villiard. And I'm just going to read a quick little bio for Miri, and then we will get started. Through public art collaborations across Minnesota, Moira Villiard is a multidisciplinary artist who uses art to uplift underrepresented narratives, explore the nuance of society's historical community intersections, and promote community healing spaces. She is proficient in a variety of artistic genres, but considers her primary medium to be space and people's interactions with it. In 2023, she was selected as a McKnight Community Engaged Artist Fellow. The mental health focused project Waiting for Beds is a collaboration with Carla Hamilton and the community and is toured around the region, uplifting the narratives around extensive wait times for care. Miri grew up on the Fond du Lac Reservation in Cloquet, Minnesota, and is a Fond du Lac direct descendant of mixed settler and Indigenous heritage. Miri works full-time as a freelance consultant, designer, speaker, and is the project director and lead artist of the Chief Buffalo Memorial murals. As a community organizer and arts educator, she concentrates her efforts around issues of equity and justice. Her overall work seeks to bridge gaps in community memory and recognition. Well, welcome, Miri. It's great to have you, and I'm gonna give you the floor here to get started.
Yeah, cool. Get started. You want intro
Yeah,
or
let's just talk a little bit about the work you do and your background, I guess. Just some basic. I know I covered kind of your bio, but it'd be great to hear your life from your point of view briefly.
yeah. No, like you said, I grew up on the Fond du Lac Reservation. I was there most of my life and then moved to Duluth in I think 2016-ish. And that's kind of where I think a lot of my art career sort of blossomed. Because there's a lot of opportunities, I think, in Duluth to get involved and to also just like learn if you don't know something about the arts. Um, And yeah, currently, I don't know if that was in the bio, but I'm at the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council kind of part-time. So I do grant writing support for folks in the Arrowhead region. And then I also have contract hours with Springboard for the Arts as an artist career consultant. So people can reach out to me on Springboard's link if they want to set up one-on-one meetings. And those are free. So yeah, I think helping artists get funding is kind of one of my passions. One of my friends says it's sort of my sport, so I get really competitive, and I really want to see people succeed. So it brings me joy.
I love it. Yeah, you've helped me. You've helped countless artists that I know, and I know you're gonna help countless artists in the future. All right. So my first question is, how did you first approach grant writing? Maybe tell us more about like what the project was that really led you to start exploring that first time that you were like, what is a grant? How do I do it? I could really use it. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got started?
Yeah. So the funny thing is, I didn't know what grants were. And I was looking for opportunities to connect with the arts community more in Duluth. I think I was like 18 years old, and just trying to figure out like how I could. I just had my first art show at the American Indian Community Housing Organization, and it kind of like opened my world to um, just a new audience. And like having a show was like it made me realize that I really wanted to keep having shows, I guess, and see where it could take me. And so I remember looking for different opportunities, and I think it might have been on like a bulletin board or minnesotaartists.org maybe, which is a great resource. But I think the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council had posted a position for their public relations department, and they were looking for an intern. And I was interested in doing like marketing and graphic design kind of professionally. So I reached out and applied. They interviewed me, and I didn't get the job, but they kind of like followed up afterwards, and they were like, would you want to serve on our board instead? We have like the student liaison position that's open, and you would learn kind of all about like kind of the grant writing world through that position. And again, like I had no idea what grant writing was. I just knew like Arrowhead Regional Arts Council, it serves artists. Like I want to know more about the arts community. Um, I wasn't expecting to land on their board. And so I said yes because I was like, that's still kind of a in, I guess. And I was in one of those phases where I was just kind of saying yes to whatever opportunity I could. Um, and I served on their board, and it was I served for about 5 years, and kind of transitioned from like the student liaison position to the regular board to the executive board for a little bit. And it was really like my first introduction to the grant writing world. And so I think from there, like I was really fortunate because it was like I feel like not a lot of people get their first exposure from like the behind the scenes. So it really gave me like a boost. And I think I always recommend people like if you see reviewer opportunities, whether it's through your local regional arts council or through the state arts board or through different foundations, take those opportunities because it's just like I don't know, in video game language, it's like a cheat code for life. Like you just kind of like, there's so much that you don't realize about the process unless you just engage with it and actually do it. And so that was my first time being exposed to grants. And then my first grant funded project, I think, was probably a small Arrowhead Regional Arts Council grant. We used to have a technology and equipment program. And so I know one of my earlier grants was like applying for funding to get an iPad so I could use Procreate to kind of do like draft of mural designs and stuff like that. And that iPad served me very well. Like yeah, the rest of my work for the next 2 years was done on that iPad until it died. So, and then, yeah, what else? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would thought it'd be great to just hear where it all started because a lot of us here kind of know where you are now, and you've built up a really great reputation for just being like the go-to person for grants. And it's just a good reminder to everyone that we all started somewhere, and there was a time when you didn't know the first thing about grants. So I just wanted everyone to kind of hear how you got started.
Yeah, it also took like 2 years of serving on the Arts Council before I really understood what grants were. So I feel like I was very quiet, very like, what is all this like criteria and like Robert's rules and like all of these things that I just had like zero exposure to. So it was like an almost like uncomfortable crash course. And I'm glad I stuck with it because I feel like it's been a big part of it's like my passion now, but I didn't know it was going to be at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's great to have people in the community pushing those because grants can be really intimidating. I know it took me a long time to finally step up and do it after years of being told, sign up for a grant, do a grant, you should do a grant, that'd be great. And I'm like, it sounds great, but it sounds scary too. So we'll get into that a little bit at the end and just talk about how to get over the hump and get into the arena and really start with your first grant. But for now, I just wanted to move on to just some basics on identifying a good grant opportunity and a bad grant opportunity and or scams that may look good and things just to watch out for. As a beginner, I would hate for someone to finally take the jump and then find out they jumped into the wrong space. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how to identify good opportunities?
Yeah, goodness. I mean, we're in an era of like tons of internet scams and like fake postings and things like that. So I think it's like a great time to be an artist because we have all of these extra resources and knowledge of them, but also like there's a lot of noise and stuff that isn't really real out there. So I think the biggest thing to be aware of is I don't think I've ever seen a grant that requires you to like pay upfront in order to apply. So if they're asking for money in any capacity, it's probably not real. The only time I can think there's something even close to that is if you're going for like state or like I think like a lot of state grants, which is usually in like healthcare or social services, but like state grants will require a match. So you might see matches, and that's when you like match some of the funding with your own funding up front, but it wouldn't be to pay directly to the government. It would be for your project, you spending your own money on that. So that's the only time I can see like having to have money first in order to get a grant. I think the second thing is really like thinking about your ethics. I have a lot of conversations with artists around, so grants are this free money, and it comes from a variety of different, institutional bodies, whether it's the government, whether it's a foundation. A lot of foundations get funding from like corporations, and it's good to kind of do your research and figure out like where does that money actually come from that you're applying for, especially if you're like a more socially engaged artist who wants to do work around like a certain topic. For instance, if you're making like artwork around like, I don't know, awareness around pipelines and stuff like that, you probably want to make sure that funding for those projects maybe isn't coming from oil companies that you're protesting against, right? So, or just be aware, right? So if someone, if an audience member points that out, sometimes people see it before we see it ourselves, because we'll get excited and we'll be like, oh, there's, I'm getting $100,000 for this project. It's amazing. And then it's like, who actually gave you that money? And do you want your name tied to it? So I think that's not necessarily a scam piece, but just like an awareness piece to learn as you're looking for funding. It doesn't just come out of thin air, it comes from somebody. So making sure that things align with your practices. And I think there's ways where I've seen like lots of different I feel like there's ways to mitigate, kind of looking for opportunities that align with your values, or not mitigate, but mitigate I lost my train of thought, but
Well, I think that it's also really helpful, and that's what makes the art community as a whole such a great resource, is that just especially the people in this call or watching this right now, by all means, they can reach out to you, and they kind of have that protection and that cushion against some of that stuff, because you can help them identify some of those basic things to watch out for. So that's one of the ways that leaning into the art community, I think, would be really great, so that you're not just going online and just clicking on the first thing that comes up on Google. I think leaning into the people who have done it before is a really good resource.
Yeah, and definitely, you want to be able to, I feel like most grant programs have some kind of staff that you can talk to. So making sure that there's people on the other side that, are willing to take a phone call or respond to your emails with like responses to the questions that you have, versus being kind of, yeah. I will say there's not, some like major foundations don't necessarily have a lot of transparency in their process. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a scam, but that's also something that you might run into, where you might ask questions about the grant, and potentially it can be viewed as giving you an unfair advantage, I've been told in some instances when I've asked questions. So
Okay.
and I don't thoroughly, I, as like a person who's worked for different granting organizations, I don't think there's such a thing as an unfair advantage if you're answering a question about like process. That's just me, but I have run into bigger foundations that are like, no, we can't answer things like, my specific question was something like, how do you select your panelists? Kind of leaning into, will there be rural representation on the panel, because there is or asking, will there be, people of different diverse backgrounds on the panel? And I was told, you can't ask that. It's an unfair advantage. You shouldn't be writing your grant to appeal to the panel specifically. But again,
That makes sense. That sounds like something that, once you're down the line a little bit and you start getting more and more of those opportunities, you do kind of learn a little bit more, and maybe you want to be a little more educated, like you were saying earlier, on where this is coming from, who's behind it, who's the community that's really supporting your project. That's just good to have in general. So, can you list off maybe like three really good organizations here in Minnesota, at least, that you would recommend, that are really approachable, that someone could easily get in touch with and maybe write their first grant?
Yeah, I definitely think utilize the free services that are through Springboard for the Arts. They're statewide, but also I think they do North Dakota, South Dakota, and they are technically national too. I think there's just people in our region are subsidized to some extent for some of the services, so we get those services free for the most part. So Springboard for the Arts, the artist consultant program for sure, like you can reach out and people can either like read your grants or give you feedback ahead of time, help you with career choices, give you an inside look at like the industry if you're just starting out and don't know if you want to head into it. That's the biggest resource we have. I think also like the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council for folks in northeastern Minnesota. Very open to just helping artists. It's been cool in my role there that they allow me to sort of assist artists with grants that aren't necessarily specific to ARAC, but that are for people in our region, because we kind of take this view that when people are getting funded in the Arrowhead region, we're getting noticed and more funding comes here. And so like, if we're all like having this success, it draws attention to the region and it brings more resources out here. So it's not just a silo in the metro. So all of the state of Minnesota has a regional arts council you can reach out to. And yeah, those would be the big two. And I'm a little biased working for both of them, but I use their services prior to working for them. So
Yes, and again, they're very approachable. They're very present in the community. You're going to run into them at events, and they are very excited to tell you about what they do, and they are very encouraging, trying to get you kind of into the loop and part of the process. So that's also what I think makes a really good organization. So they're not just sitting back and in the shadows. They're out and about. They know the artists, that they know the people, they know the community.
I also think it never hurts to ask like the artists themselves that you see like, getting funded for different things. And that's going to vary depending on the artist. Like some people really like to hold on to their resources and view everything as a competition, but there's some people who are not in that boat at all, who are like me, who are very excited to just be like, oh, I got like the Bush Fellowship this past year. Totally want to help a ton of people get like the Bush Fellowship after I got it, right? Like, so I
Yes.
think yeah, seeing who, especially, I think community engaged artists tend to have like a little bit more open, are a little more open-minded to that philosophy of like, if we all succeed, then we're, all succeeding.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we've talked a little bit about the organizations, some of the basics on finding these organizations. I wanted to take the next segment of time and talk a little bit about the actual nuts and bolts of writing a grant, the process of sitting down and starting one of these, and some of the things that you've learned and some of the best practices that you've learned. So I guess starting off with the basics, can you tell me just in a general way what elements make a strong proposal? What elements make a strong grant? When you've read, I'm sure, countless grants, what are the things that stick out to you where you step back and go like, oh, that's good right there?
Yeah. So my personal, I think, philosophy on grant writing is it's like if you could condense it down to two things, it's excitement and it's thoroughness. Under excitement, you kind of have, well, I'll start with thoroughness. So like what I mean by thoroughness is kind of like how well and how completely did you answer the questions that were asked of you on the grant proposal? And usually I think pretty much all funders will offer like criteria for what they're scoring for. And those criteria for artists are generally the quality of your work, the feasibility, and the impact. And I would break impact up into like the impact on you in your career at the moment that you describe your career as being, and the impact on the community that you serve or your audiences or the population that the funder is sort of targeting with the grant, if there is one. And so under like quality of work, they're really looking at whatever work samples you submit. If they ask for work samples, they'll just be judging, on the does your work present itself as work that is, that demonstrates that you're working towards being an artist. Even if, yeah, I can talk a little bit more about quality maybe after I get through this little list, but yeah. Also your resume. So making sure that like your resume shows not necessarily that you're getting like huge solo shows or doing like major publishing opportunities all the time, but that like time wise, like you're consistently using opportunities every, every month or whatever, that are related to the work that you do and show that you're kind of immersed and moving forward. And they'll usually judge quality based on how you identify where you're at in your career too. So it is totally okay. With the exception of like, you don't want to say this on a established artist grant, right? But for most general grants, it's completely okay to say, I'm an emerging artist. This is what I've been working on in the last few years. This is where I want to go. If you're an established artist, I usually tell people to kind of frame it around, this is where I'm at. This is kind of what I've achieved. And here are the things I'm either going to keep the same or adjust slightly. And the funding is going to help me do that adjustment or explore deeper in some area. Feasibility is just, can you do it? And so again, they'll kind of look at it that like, if you're an emerging artist and you're like, I want to do like 10 solo shows in a year, and you've never done a solo show before, that's not terribly feasible. But if you're an emerging artist and you say, I want to do like my first solo show this year, and here's kind of the plan to get there. They'll evaluate that plan and that'll contribute to your feasibility. So it's kind of weighing like, what have you done in the past and what expectations do you have of yourself? And sometimes that means reducing your project to like maybe a smaller thing, because you also have to take into account the money that you're being given. So if it's like $1,000 grant, you're probably not going to do, I don't know, some major publishing deal and like sell millions of copies of a book, right? Like you're gonna maybe pay yourself to write the book. And that's where the $1,000 goes. So making sure that your finances line up with what you're saying that you're gonna do. Don't oversell it, but don't undersell it. And I think you'll get penalized more if you say you're gonna do more than you actually could pay for. So it's better to be on the higher end. And then, yeah, I think impact, like I said, I break it down into the impact on you as an artist. So again, that's evaluating where you're at in your career and what this grant is going to help you do to get to another stage. And for impact on audience, it's more like what are the changes or the shifts or the improvements that will happen for the community as a result of your artwork? Are they going to gain more awareness of a certain issue or things like that? So that's kind of the thoroughness bucket. And then the excitement piece is, when I'm writing grants, I'll kind of like, for thoroughness, I'll put all the questions in like a bullet point list and then like a sub bullet point and make sure I answer all of the questions in one sentence or one or two sentences. The excitement piece comes in where I start talking about like, why do I do this work? Are there personal stories that connect me to the audiences or the work that I want to create with the grant? Just why is it important? Because I think sometimes people answer all the questions. But if there's not that excitement about like, well, why you, what makes this, opportunity meaningful? It can get, yeah, you can get scored lower on those instances. So making sure you've got both. But if you lean too far, right, you can also lean too far into excitement and be like, I really care about this issue, and only talk about the issue and not your art. That can also, that's, I think, even more common where people are like, we need to talk about like, I don't know, climate change. And here's these statistics and here's why it's important. And then they never say what they're going to do in their art to combat climate change.
It's
So
all build up and then there's no resolution.
yeah.
All right. So when someone is writing out a grant, there's like so many things to touch on. You just want to be careful not to have some balance and not to be completely all in on like one particular area.
Yeah. Answer the question, be excited about it, make it relevant. I think it waters down to those things. And then, there's specifics in all those different buckets, but those are the main ideas, I think.
And I would say in my experience, another little sub point you can add to that is to ask for help. Grants are, there's no penalty for asking someone to look at your grant and say, hey, how does this look? How does it read? What do you think? Right?
including staff, like a lot of the time, if you ask far enough in advance, staff can get back to you, and it's their job to be present in those meetings. The evaluation meetings, right? When you submit a grant, it goes to a panel. The panel reads it beforehand, and then usually there's a meeting where everybody talks about why they scored it a certain way, and there's sometimes opportunity for them to change their score based on discussion. The staff will be usually present during the discussion, but they can't advocate or like give extra knowledge. So that's again why the thoroughness is important. But at the same time, like they've sat in on usually so many meetings that like I know for myself, I have like a panel in my head at all times when I'm reading people's grants. And so, I can read someone's application beforehand and I can hear in my head like where are the holes, where are the gaps, what are the things that are making this not thorough, or like what would make this, you know, tied up into a really exciting proposal for the panel. And I can give that feedback of like, you might get, a question around like, I don't know, do you have your venue confirmed for what you're doing? You might get knocked off for feasibility if you don't mention that. And maybe you didn't even realize that you forgot to put that in there, or you didn't think that you had to have that up front. So we can summon the panel in our heads to help folks.
Yes, wonderful. Well, so after you've worked through like writing it, kind of getting it in front of some people who can help you strengthen it. What would you recommend to people who they've written it, they've rewritten it, when is that good point to just hit send and put it out there? Can you maybe alleviate some of those anxieties about like, what if I don't get it? What if it doesn't succeed? I would hate to, submit it and then it does. What is the mentality around being successful at writing these things? Because there is a chance that you aren't going to get it.
Yeah, there's definitely that chance is always there. Um, so I think one way to look at that fact is that like when you write the grant, right, you're kind of like summarizing a moment in time and an idea that like doesn't necessarily go away if you don't get the funding, right? Like you've just written kind of like an updated biography usually when you're writing these grants. You've just like mapped out a bit of a plan for the next year for like what your goals are and the type of art that you want to make. So I would say, like, on the note of like, even if you don't get the grant, you can always ask for feedback again from the staff, and apply again, or shift it over to another application with the feedback that you've been given and see if it works somewhere else with the changes. Um, Shoot, what was your question again?
Well, I guess I was just expanding on, there's people who are
Oh,
going to see this who may have signed up for a grant before, and I just want to share with people like what your mindset is around those times when you don't successfully get that grant. Like, how do you approach that? How do you respond and turn it into something that'll help you in the future?
yeah, I think again, like those usable pieces, like don't waste the process, I guess, additionally, I keep having a thought that like hits me when you start talking and then it like flies away. It was about like how do you know when you're done with a grant too, right? Like when do you hit submit? Um I think for me, part of like my process is I'll like print out my application and kind of like pretend I'm a panelist and like read it with a panel in my own head of like, okay, if I'm not me, right? Like pretend I've never seen my artwork before. And I'm seeing this for the first time. Where are again, like the holes in the application? Um, and I'll highlight too, like, use the criteria. So you'll get the criteria from the foundation or funder. Circle the spots in your application where you see you answered that question, because I think that's a big thing is again, like double checking that thoroughness, which you don't necessarily like, and this is mostly if you haven't already done like the bullet point strategy of like answering the question in one sentence each time. If you don't function well with lists like that, like the alternative could be like write your grant and then go through and circle all the areas that it's answering each of the questions. So you know at least that you've answered everything. Because I think at a base level, that's kind of all you can do. All the panel can evaluate you on is what you submit. Usually they're not allowed to look you up on the internet afterwards, usually, unless it's specified in the application. Usually you're not allowed to submit like links to other work. Or like links to your website and things like that. Some grants do allow that, but I know like the regional arts councils tend to just only evaluate on what you submit. So I've seen people who miss that instruction and they'll submit like, here's my biography. You can go to my website and read all about me. And it's like, no, we can't actually. So now we don't have your, biography. So yeah, and also just going through those instructions one more time at the end too, just making sure you've hit all those instruction points, because it's very easy to miss missteps. Speaking from
Wonderful.
experience.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. And I think sometimes the best thing to do is just to get that experience. I think you're better off writing a grant and failing. I think that you're in a better position than just sitting around waiting to do that first grant.
Yeah, yep, because you get that feedback, right? Or you get that extra set of eyes that, yeah, can be super vital. And again, definitely like I can't recommend enough, like serve on a panel. The Area Regional Arts Council always has calls for reviewers on their website. Sign up. Your brain will grow so much just from that experience. And also like I think it's important to serve from the standpoint of like your perspective being in the room, and maybe you do have like a perspective that has been missing fundamentally from the panel review. Like I feel like I'm always kind of trying to advocate for like rural folks because I grew up rural, and like making sure a lot of the time I'm the only person who grew up in a rural community who's on a
Mhm.
panel, and a lot of the time it's metro folks, and they have different standards for like the quality of work, or they have standards around feasibility that don't take into account that rural perspective. And so having a seat at the table with your unique perspectives is also just really good for the community. And the other piece you can learn by serving on a panel is just reading other people's applications and seeing how the different approaches are that people have. Experiencing kind of like that human side of the process, because at the end of the day, like it's not AI, it's humans at this point
Yep.
in time when we're
At this
making
point
this
in time.
video. I don't know what the future holds, but for now, human beings are a major part of grant review. Which leads me to actually another point in the conversation around grant writing. I don't know, not everybody can tell, but I can 100% tell whenever someone's written something with AI. And I think that can ding you a little bit on your excitement piece, because AI just has this voice. And it's kind of a tiring, like droning on, like, here's a bunch of big words, but do they really like mean anything? And so if you're going to use AI, and I feel like there hasn't been a lot of conversations yet in the arts funding world, but if you're going to use AI, my personal opinion is like, I think it's effective as if like English is a second language and you feel like there's going to be a bias against the grammar that you use. I think that's a major help for folks in that situation. Or if you have like a learning disability or things like that, where like you really need that like extra support on those not on the content but on the structure, because at the end of the day you're not supposed to be graded on grammar, but there's biases in a human process. And I think it would be crazy to deny that that those biases don't exist, whether it's the urban rural, whether it's different isms, racism, sexism, all of these different things. There's classism, there's just biases that sneak in. And so if you feel like AI helps you bypass a potential ism, I think that's a radical way to use it. But I would not recommend going to an AI like ChatGPT and writing the grant questions and then submitting the responses the robot gives you, because the robot can't make your project like yet
Yep.
at this present moment in time.
Copy and pasting. Nope. we'll put that down in the notes for sure.
Yeah.
So before we do our Q&A at 6:15, I just wanted to cover two last little items here that I wanted you to touch on. One of them is going to be community engagement practices. Can you tell me a little bit more about just how to be a good community member and how that kind of feeds into grants? I know earlier I talked about how when you are engaged with your community, you meet people who write grants and who are on boards. Can you just expand a little bit on just community engagement in general?
Yeah, so my first thought was maybe more related to like arts organizations, like a faux pas, I would call it, that I've seen where, folks think like DEI is kind of trendy right now. And so they're like, we're gonna reach like 15% more people in the Black community with a project with this funding. And they'll write like this great grant about like, here's all these statistics and here's how we want to change this thing with our project. And then they won't include a budget for like marketing or, and it's just like, okay, well, if you've never served, people in the Black community before, like you're saying you've had, you know, nobody showing up and you have this idea, it's like, how are they gonna know? The whole TikTok voice. How are they gonna know? um, and so I think, and this could apply for like individual artists too. Like if you're gonna try something new, make sure like the thread that connects everything makes sense. Like if there's an area that you identify that you're weaker in, which is I think a good thing to do in a grant is to identify a problem or a weakness. Make sure your solution and everything matches up and is feasible, right? Um, so I think that's a that's a major thing.
Absolutely. And when you're trying to reach communities, yeah, that's also, we're artists, we like to create, but yeah, there's so many things, peripheral things to keep in mind when you're putting these on, such as like an event. I know that having an event at the end of your grant to showcase what you've done and to showcase your work is really helpful. Can you tell us a little bit more about planning an event to showcase like what you've created?
Yeah. I'll say maybe one more thing on the community piece too. Making sure so as artists, like we're good at like eliciting the unseen, like the things that don't necessarily or like aren't visible or heard. But be careful of speaking on behalf of other people. Other people have said this, but I think it's important not to give voice to the voiceless, but to just allow the voiceless to have a platform to have their voice, heard. And so I think as artists, we sometimes walk a fine line there, but make sure that what you're doing is relevant and true to like who you are. If you're an ally, don't create work on behalf of, a specific community that you're an ally to. Create it from your perspective as an ally. That is valuable, So that was the other thought that popped into my head.
I
And
like it.
then planning events. Yeah. I think for planning events, make sure that you're reaching out to venues and just constantly having these conversations, even prior to like applying for a grant, because the grants will, at this point in time, always exist. And so you can kind of look ahead and see like, part of my planning is looking at like when did a call for proposals come out. So like I'll look at like McKnight, Bush, the Regional Arts Council, State Arts Board, Forecast Public Art, different funders like that. Springboard for the Arts has a nice list on their website too. Look at when they have historically been funding things or releasing grants and kind of make note of that. And then continuously like reaching out to organizations and like even just going to events, especially events that are by artists who are maybe doing similar work. So you can kind of like enter those networks a little bit more if you haven't already. Especially on like if you're an emerging artist, like if you want to do murals, like show up to a community mural session with a mural artist and pick their brain a little bit about, how did this project exactly happen? And just like using those resources. But I think, yeah, having the calendar and being proactive, I think are two of the biggest tools that I think are important. And then, yeah, don't be last minute. I know it's hard, but I think, making sure that whatever event you plan is like meaningful for you. So sometimes there can be a pressure, and this is kind of connected to that organization example I gave earlier, but sometimes there's a pressure to like fit into the grant guidelines a little bit more. Like maybe
Hmm.
the grant is specifically like we want rural people like doing dance specifically, and or I don't know, just like if they have a specific goal, right? And maybe you're like a, I don't know, a potter in a mid-sized city or something. Like, don't try and bend yourself into, something that's for rural dancers, right? That was an extreme example, but kind of like the overarching point is if it doesn't really feel like you can make something meaningful with it for yourself and for your community, it's probably better not to put all those resources into it. I think collaboration is great. And doing like cross-disciplinary work is great, but just make sure that's what you actually want to do. And you're not just like changing your vision or your mission to fit into criteria that maybe doesn't apply to you as much.
Absolutely. And I love that about the process of writing a grant. I think you said it earlier when you talked about how it helps you plan out like your next year. And I would say that not only that, but it also, when I write grants, it helps me get in touch with a little bit more about like who I am as an artist and what actually genuinely excites me. You talked about how you want to have excitement when you're writing and enthusiasm. If you're having like trouble, like even sounding excited, maybe you aren't actually excited about that. So sometimes it may sound cliche, but at times it's a good idea just to follow your heart and just go with where the direction that your mind and your is leading you into, as opposed to trying to fit into a certain box of a grant, because there's all kinds of grants out there, right?
Yeah, I think I've seen people post on Facebook too. There was one artist I know who posted like, if you could describe my work, she was having a block around like how she describes her work. You can also just call on your friends. Like, I think I described her work as like amazingly chunky color textures or something like that. But it was like, that's what I see. Because sometimes we're artists, we're in it, we're creating. It's hard for us to see what is unique about ourselves because we're just living in it. So it's helpful to have those outside perspectives. And the last thing I'll say on that is like, what I tell everyone is like, avoid. So like all artists create because of the human condition or inspired by the human condition. It is like the overarching like default response. And I encourage anyone who uses like a biography or an artist statement that says like, I create art that talks about human emotions or about the human condition to really like zoom in a little bit more and look at like what aspect of the human condition or aspect of human emotions are you exploring. Some people, the same thing could be said for like, maybe you do portraits of, I don't know, paintings of nature, right? Or music inspired by nature. Again, that's so broad. Like, what specifically about nature like gets you excited? Like, for me, it's insects, right? Like, and specifically like the ones that are iridescent. And that makes you like more memorable because across the board, I think like at least a third to half of all grant applications are going to have an answer like, I'm inspired by the lake, I'm inspired by human condition,
Yep.
I'm inspired by bringing people joy. And it's just like the next stage. And the thing that I think gets people over the edge in grant writing is identifying where you zoom in, and it can totally change. But for the purposes of the grant, zoom in, find the specific thing, and then write your proposal around that specific thing and connect it to your project. Like, I want to do paintings of iridescent bugs because blah, blah, blah. Like, so yeah.
All right. Well, Mary, I appreciate you speaking with us today. We're gonna pivot over into our Q&A to our attendees, but I just wanted to thank you again for sharing your insight, all your years of experience. Again, this program is the Duluth Art Institute Professional Development Series. This program is made possible by a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board. And check in next week. We have 5 more weeks of this. Every Monday, we're going to have a brand new artist that talks about their own discipline and their crafts. So we're going to be covering a variety of things from living as a freelance artist to creating work in the video game community and going to conventions and selling your work at conventions. So there's a whole variety of things. Keep an eye out on the Duluth Art Institute website. Miri, what's your website for our listeners?
It's www.artbymoira.com.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.